My children Sam and Robbie are twin 6-year-olds. A year ago, we were forced to move out of our old house due to unforeseen circumstances. It is an extremely long and horrible story. We lived in the old house for 4 whole years. During that time, I married my wife Carol, and also our home became the birthplace of our children. Unfortunately, our neighborhood began to gradually deteriorate. Despite this, we always intended to stay in this house in the near future until something unforeseen happened. We lived in a corner house, and the house behind ours was surrounded by thick trees and shrubbery, so we almost never noticed our neighbors. However, our neighbor to the right was named Steve. He moved here less than a year ago. I only had a couple conversations with him. Because of his strong accent, I had a hard time understanding what he was saying, and overall he did not give the impression of being a friendly person. He had 2 windows facing the backyard, but I never saw a light on in them at any time of the day or night. I thought it was a room designated for guests or something like that. One summer, Sam and Robbie were playing in the backyard in the inflatable pool and with water pistols while I was doing yard work. At one point, as I was walking toward the detached garage, I briefly saw Steve through his window in the neighboring house. After a few seconds of noticing him, he turned around and disappeared from view. This struck me as a bit odd, but I disregarded the remark. Later that day, as the sun began to set, the children went outside again to play. The weather was very hot, so they went back to their inflatable pool while I stayed in the kitchen making dinner. A while later, the kids were quiet, and suddenly Robbie came into the house and reported that there was a light flashing in the neighbor's window. Robbie and I went out to the backyard, and I pointed to one of the windows at the top of Steve's house that faced the backyard, and he said that the light was coming through from that window all the time. Instantly, I had a worst guess and asked the twins if it was a camera flash. Both replied that it was. I told them to go back inside. I helped them wipe themselves off, and then Carol and I discussed the case. We immediately suspected the worst. Carol said I should go next door and knock on Steve's door. I did so, but he didn't answer the door. He had his car in the driveway, so it was assumed he must have been home. After several unsuccessful attempts to knock and ring, I decided to go home. I told Carol that our neighbor wasn't answering the door, and that just backed up what the kids were saying, even though we had no proof that the white light the kids saw was a camera flash. But it was very much like her, and that was alarming. One night when Carol and I were in the bedroom, we heard a gate quietly opening and closing outside. Carol asked me to check to see what was wrong. I went out to the backyard and looked around. Turning on all the flashlights, I started looking but found nothing and no one. However, I did notice a light on in Steve's backyard. I walked over to the fence and peered into his yard. I was almost immediately overcome with panic when he came up on the other side and asked if I needed help. I asked him if he had seen anyone sneaking through our yard. He answered in the negative. I also asked him if he noticed someone watching my kids when they were playing in the pool. His response was suspicious. He took offense to my question and even started snapping at me for this accusation. I had no proof and didn't want to cause problems with my neighbor, so I apologized and went back into the house. Carol was not happy, calling him a rude person. The next incident happened a few weeks later when we were all asleep. I woke up to Carol's panicked scream shaking me. I looked around the room, a little confused. But as soon as I heard the children's screams from their room, I leaped out of bed and ran down the stairs to the children's room. Roddy woke up crying, and Sammy echoed his cries with his scream. Roddy said there was someone at the window a moment ago, and then there was a flash of a camera. My goosebumps ran, and my blood boiled at the same time. I asked what he looked like. Roddy replied that he couldn't see. I took the kids up to our room to sleep next to us. Turning off the light, I looked out of our bedroom window, directing my gaze to Steve's dark house. I looked around every window of his house and spotted him. He, like me, was peeking through an upstairs window in a room overlooking the backyard. I ran outside and knocked on his door several times. He never opened it. I called the police and left a report on Steve. If there are reports from other people in the future, maybe the police will look into it. I never saw him again. Sometimes I would sit near the entrance hoping he would come out, but he always avoided when I was around. So after a month, we moved to a new house in another city. It turned out to be the best place to raise children. Moving into a new house is always a rather nerve-wracking experience, but my fears were soon replaced by anxiety when I met our neighbor, Mrs. Simmons. She seemed friendly at first, but something about her gave me an inexplicable feeling. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she looked at me for too long. Mrs. Simmons was an elderly woman who had lived alone in the house next door for decades, and her neighbors always thought she was eccentric. Nevertheless, I tried to be a good neighbor and welcome her. But the first strange incident occurred when I was working in the yard. Mrs. Simmons appeared suddenly, her frail body just materialized by the fence. She looked at me with great interest and did not respond to my greeting. She just stood there and watched. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more oddities in her behavior. Mrs. Simmons spent many hours at the window looking out into our yard. At times, I found her standing in the dark in the middle of the night. It gave me the creeps. One night, I decided to visit her and brought freshly baked cookies. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. I figured she wasn't home, so I left the cookies on her doorstep with a note. The next morning, the cookies were gone, but Mrs. Simmons was nowhere to be seen. I figured she liked it, but the uneasiness still remained. It seemed as if she never left the house during the day. One evening, while my wife and I were watching television, we heard a quiet, rhythmic tapping on our living room window. We jumped up and rushed to the window with aching hearts. There in the darkness stood Mrs. Simmons, her wrinkled face pressed against the glass and her eyes staring intently at us. I yelled for her to leave, but she didn't react. She just stood there, tapping her bony fingers on the window in a slow and deliberate rhythm. It resembled a scene from a horror movie. Out of fear, we called the police, who came to talk to Mrs. Simmons. She said she just wanted to meet her new neighbors, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They warned her to respect our personal space and to refuse further intrusions. Things were quiet for a while, and we hoped it was over. But one day a strange package appeared on our doorstep. Inside was a collection of old photographs. They were pictures of our home, of our family, taken without our consent. We realized with alarm that Mrs. Simmons had been spying on us for a long time. We felt hurt and unsafe in our own home. We called the police again, and they spoke to Mrs. Simmons again, this time sternly warning her of her actions. Months passed, and Mrs. Simmons became increasingly unapproachable. She rarely left the house, and if she did, it was in the evening, under cover of darkness. It seemed as if we were living next to a shadow, a presence that was always hidden and watching. We installed CCTV and took extra security measures, but the feeling of being watched never left us. Our once idyllic new home became a nightmare, overshadowed by a strange and disturbing neighbor. Eventually, Mrs. Simmons died, and the house remained empty for a long time. Everyone in the neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief, but memories of her frightening presence still haunted us. Meeting Mrs. Simmons taught us that sometimes the scariest things can happen in the most ordinary places, and that even behind the facade of ordinariness, there can be darkness